Welcome to the Technical Feature Enablement video for Implicit Consent for Purposes. This feature is now generally available as of the 2025 02.1.0 release, also known as the 2025 Winter release. This video reflects OneTrust's current expectations for product capabilities, but dates and features may be subject to change and should not be relied upon when making purchasing decisions. Let's get started. Implicit Consent for Purposes is a new feature for consent admins that provides a new status to log a data subject's implicit consent. To be clear, in some cases, a person's action, inaction, or situational circumstance may indicate their agreement even though they may not explicitly state it. For example, a data subject may purchase toothpaste and, by doing so, may also need a toothbrush. Your company may want to email suggestions for related products, such as popular toothbrushes. Before this feature release, there was no inbuilt direct method for tracking implicit consent for a given purpose. With the ability to track implicit consent, businesses can activate data proportionally to the strength of the consent, allowing data subjects to strengthen or legitimize their consent by explicitly overriding the implicit consent. For example, in the toothbrush scenario, a data subject could later override the implicit consent to explicitly opt in or opt out for broader marketing emails. But before we walk through the product, there are a few caveats and prerequisites. First, we caution you not to over-rely on implicit consent when it may be inappropriate to do so. Also, there is currently no UI in the web forms to capture implicit consent, so the implicit consent can only be captured via consent receipts submitted via the API. Also, a reminder that the explicit checkbox does not show by default in the Preference Center. You must enable it. Finally, a reminder that before you can capture implicit consent with this new feature, you must first enable it for each specific purpose where you wish to allow it. Let's examine implicit consent in action. The slider to enable implicit consent is in the Purposes setup in Consent and Preference Management. On the Details tab, under General Information, there is a new slider to enable implicit consent. As mentioned before, there is also a slider to show the explicit consent checkbox in the Preference Center, allowing consumers to confirm their explicit consent. If you choose to enable the checkbox, you can choose the text verbiage to display. Note that the verbiage can also be localized to other languages by clicking on the Translations tab and editing the version for other languages. Let's first submit an implicit consent receipt to my API collection point to see implicit consent working. To illustrate the API call, I'm using curl to call my collection point and provide the details from the example payload as part of the call. I have the identifier, in this case an email address, request information as defined in the API collection point, and the array of purpose IDs and transaction types. In this case, I'm only submitting the single purpose I've configured for implicit consent with a transaction type of implicit. Upon submitting to the collection point, you can see the call is successful and I get the receipt details in the response. Now, I'll go to Data Subject Profiles and find the profile I just created. I'll click on the profile and then click on the Purposes tab. Note that I have a new transaction indicating the successful implicit consent. If I log in as the specific user in the Preference Center by generating the magic link, you note that the purpose is enabled because of the implicit consent. However, you can now check the box to confirm your explicit consent. If I do this and update the preferences, I can go back into the data subject details and see that the purpose is now active. Alternatively, let's look at a scenario where implicit consent has been captured, but the data subject hesitates and clicks to deny consent in the Preference Center. Even if the preferences aren't updated, you'll notice that if I re-enable the toggle, the implicit consent checkbox doesn't reappear because I've now explicitly consented by re-enabling the toggle. Now, depending on my choice via the toggle, I can grant my explicit consent or withdraw my consent for the purpose. Thank you for watching this video. We hope it was helpful and informative. Please see the additional videos on my OneTrust covering the new features in other product areas. If you want more details about the 2025 Winter release or what's going on with the product, be sure to check out the OneTrust Talks Tech podcast.